Hey everybody, welcome to Ontario Nazarene's YouTube channel. My name is Lauren and I'm one of the pastors here at Ontario Nazarene. Thanks so much for checking us out today. We believe that you are not here by accident and that you have been created on purpose for a purpose. And we want to help you discover what that is and what that means for your life. And so we have a special message just for you today. So sit back, enjoy, and if you'd like to know more about how to connect with us here at Ontario Nazarene, stay tuned to find out more at the end of the message.
And so I have a question to ask this morning, and let's put that question on the screen for us today. The question is, who's in charge? Who's in charge? Now, if you live in a home with a 5-year-old like we do, you know who's in charge, right? Yeah, there's more truth to that than we care to admit, but it's an important question. And for those of us that are Christians, that are followers of Christ, we kind of know the answer to that question, or what should be the answer, right? We know the Sunday school answer to that question, right? And it's an important question for us to consider and think of more than just once, because if we're being honest, we kind of tend in life to kind of drift towards compartmentalizing our lives in a sense, in some ways. You know, I've got my church life, I've got my home life, I've got my school life, work life, whatever it might be. We kind of like to kind of keep those separate sometimes. But for those of us that follow Christ, we know that shouldn't be the case, right? We know that all of those things, all of those different areas of life should be connected to our faith, that our faith should influence those areas of our lives. And so our lives in a lot of ways are kind of like these boxes that I have up here this morning. There's this me box. Right, and these are the areas and the things in my life, the parts of my life that I kind of want to keep control of for myself. Right? I kind of enjoy being in control, enjoy making the decisions all on my own. Right? That's our me box. Or we have the God box, right? And these are the areas of my life where I've decided I'm going to trust God with. So we have these two boxes that represent our lives, and so we have to decide on an ongoing basis, who am I going to trust? Who's in charge? Am I going to trust me or am I going to trust God first, right? I hear some great answers out there. That's great. But for example, when it comes to something like our family, isn't that a good-looking family? Yeah. Who are we going to trust with our family, in our marriage, in our parenting, right? In our relationships? Who are we going to trust? Is it going to be me or is it going to be God? Or maybe when it comes to our finances, right? That's a good-looking piggy bank, isn't it? Who are we going to trust first, me or God? Or maybe when it comes to our possessions. And my son made me promise that I'd push the button today, okay? Just so you know. You probably can't hear that online, but that's the sound of the truck. All right, what are we going to do with our possessions? Are we going to trust us first, me first, or God first? When it comes to my job, right, whatever that might be, your career, where are we placing our trust? When it comes to school, right? My friends, my academics, all that kind of stuff, who am I going to trust first? Or maybe it's our skills, our abilities, right? The things we enjoy doing, the gifts God has given us. Who are we going to trust first? I hear some answers out there. It's God, isn't it? That's who we should trust. That's why we put all the things in the God box. Am I going to trust me and what I think, my opinions, right, my understandings first, or am I going to trust God? Well, that's kind of the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about that here in the big adult room. We're also going to talk about that down with our kids, and our fusion students are talking about this stuff this morning. So if you have a little one that would like to go, I believe Pastor Connie is here. Yes, she's here this morning. She's going to come and she's going to meet you down there at the hallway. If you're new with us this morning and you have yet to check your child in, we'd love to have you go down with them and get them checked in. Make sure we can send them back with you nice and safe. Go ahead, bud. Yeah, we can look at that later. Look at all those great kids. Man, they're going to have a good time down there. I hope you join them. I guess I didn't announce what ages. That's age 5 and 6 up through 5th grade. Can go down there with them. And so this morning we're going to continue in this series that Pastor Tim started last week on the life of David. And it's a series on this David character that takes up much of our Old Testament, right? We've got 1st and 2nd Samuel, which talks about him. We see his life from a very early age all the way through the time that he was a king. And last week we were introduced to him as a young boy, where he was anointed by God himself to play a very special role, to be someone very special, to be a very special person in God's plan for the world, God's plan for humanity at that time. And so all throughout this series, we'll discover two things about David, that he was both beloved and broken. But today I'm excited because we get to jump into one of the most well-known events in David's life, the event that would make him the most popular man in all of Israel. And so we discovered last week that David, his story begins somewhere around the 11th century BC. And something I think that we don't often think about very often or don't consider is the state of the world when David was alive, when he was living, when he was growing up, when he was ruling as king. I think we don't often consider that David grew up and lived in a very, very violent time in the history of the world, in the history of humanity. It's a period of history that was so violent that it's really hard for us here in the 21st century to really grasp and understand what life must have been like back in those days. In fact, when it comes to ancient times and ancient warfare especially, we kind of glamorize it a bit if we're being honest. You know, with Hollywood, they make these movies and things. It's kind of glamorized and romanticized a bit, and we kind of lose a real grasp of what life was really like back then. You know, if you've ever seen a movie like Braveheart or Gladiator, a couple of those movies we see them and they're disturbing if we're being honest. They're so very violent. They're so very bloody and all of that stuff. It really offends us. But if you've ever studied ancient times, ancient warfare, honestly, those movies are a little weak compared to what life was really like in those days. Really, the only ones that could really understand the world in those days are those that lived it, those that lived through it, those that were there, those that experienced the smells of war. Right? Those that experience fear day in, day out for their lives because of the warring culture that they lived in. You know, nowadays when we see or when we experience images of war, it's from afar, isn't it? It's through the lens of a camera that are miles and miles and miles away. But in David's day, you experienced war from the edge of your shield. You experienced war with your nose, with your mouth, with your throat, with your senses. It was so very real, so close and so personal, so much more than it is for us today. In David's day, you'd look up and you'd stare in the eyes of your enemy. And when you saw him, you saw one of two things. You saw incredible fear or incredible fearlessness. And if you saw the latter, you were in trouble because you were looking into the eyes of a professional killer. And chances of you surviving that encounter were very, very slim. It was a brutal time in history. It was an awful time. It was a terrible time in which to live. Now, aren't you all encouraged this morning? Isn't that the best introduction to a sermon you've ever heard? I think it's really important for us to think about and consider David's life through that context, though. Through the way things really were, through the way the world was. Because today we're stepping into an event in David's life that takes place in this context of ancient warfare. And all of its smells, all of its fears, all of the realities that go along with that. And so this morning, if you've got your Bibles with you, or your YouVersion app on your phone, I invite you to take those out at this time. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17 as we jump into this well-known event in David's life. 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning with verse 1. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-Dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion, you know this guy, named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits in a span, which most historians would say is about 9.5 feet tall." That's hard for us to imagine how tall that is. So I looked around when I was preparing, trying to find what could I compare that to that's 9.5 feet tall. And so I measured our crossover here, if you can see that, From the top of the stage to the crossbeam is about 9 feet. So a little taller than that. Can you imagine a person that tall, that big? Yeah. But not only that, Goliath, if he was going into war, he would have carried on his body over 125 pounds of armor. Imagine 125 pounds, an extra, right? Man, yeah, an impressive individual. And he would carry along with him this spear that was 6 feet long as I am tall. 6 feet long spear with this head of sharpened iron on it that weighed 15 pounds alone. Imagine this individual. There's a reason we call him a giant. And imagine him going into war. Imagine the power and the reach he would have. A man that tall, his wingspan, his arm would have been nearly 5 feet long. Add to that this 6 foot long spear, yeah, no one could touch him, right? Imagine that reach. Imagine the chaos, the havoc, the death that he could cause. An impressive individual. This is the type of man that this Goliath would have been. Let's read on in verse 8. It says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul?" Remember Saul, the first king of Israel? He said, "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then Goliath the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul, the king, and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And so what we have here is describing what we would call this method of ancient warfare known as the battle by champions. This is a battle by champions. In this tradition, each army, each nation would send out their champion to represent the entire nation. And they would send them to fight one another. And it's based on the belief that the gods of each of these nations would be fighting through these champions, would be fighting through these individuals. And whoever won must have the most powerful god, right? And so the results of that battle was winner would take all. And so Scripture would tell us that Goliath would come out day after day after day after day, taunting, criticizing, mocking the nation of Israel. So what did they need? What did Israel need? They needed a champion. They needed a champion. And so where did they look? They looked to their king. They looked to their king. They looked to King Saul, the great warrior in his own right, who stood head and shoulders above the other Israelites. They placed their hope in their king, waiting for him to come out of his tent and respond to the challenge of the giant Goliath. But for whatever reason, we can imagine, Saul was a no-show. He wouldn't show up on the battlefield. And every day that went by, every day that passed, the more mocking, the more criticizing by Goliath. Every day that went by, the armies of Israel began to lose more and more and more hope. Now, there's a bit of a lesson here for the nation of Israel in all of this. If you remember last week, Pastor Tim, he reminded us that God never really wanted the nation of Israel to have an earthly king, a king of their own. God, he wanted them to see him as their king, right? That he never wanted them to have a king, but God wanted them to see him as their king because God knew something very important. He knew that wherever you place your trust is where you will place your hope. Wherever you place your trust is where you will place your hope. And God wanted Israel to place their hope in him. But unfortunately, Israel, they looked around. They saw all the other cool kids had a king. We want one too. So they demanded a king. And ultimately, their trust and their hope would move off of God onto the king. But what's interesting about all of this is it kind of sets the stage for David's life and for this event in his life. As you know, David would eventually become Israel's second king, and most would consider him to be Israel's greatest king. But he was not their greatest king because he was a perfect man or a perfect king. He's far from it. Far from it. We'll discover that in this series. But he was their greatest king because he was both confident and humble, and he understood something very important. See, what made David unique is that he loved God's law. He loved it. Now, most kings loved laws, as long as they were the one making the laws. But David was different. He was unique. Most kings, they would change the laws in order to allow them to do whatever it is they wanted to do. But David was different. He loved God's law, even when it condemned him, even when it made him guilty. And instead of trying to change the law, David chose to submit to it. And when he broke the law, when he allowed himself to stray, to break the law that he knew was right, he allowed himself to become guilty, to be guilty, to feel guilty, to be broken, and seek reconciliation with God. He's very different than the other kings. See, this is because David, he knew something and understood something very important. And that was the mission that God had given the nation of Israel. Even though David was far from perfect like us, far from perfect, just like us, David, his convictions about God provided him with something that we wish we all had more of. It provided him with extreme clarity in life. He saw things clearly. He understood that God had given the nation of Israel a unique mission in the world, and that the law was the foundation of that mission. And so it gave him amazing clarity about God's plans and purposes in the world and his limited role in those plans. See, throughout his entire imperfect reign as king, David, he was never confused about who the true king was, who Israel's true king was. And he was never confused about his role in that plan. Despite all that he had, despite all the power, the authority as king, despite all of his popularity, despite all of his success and skills and talents, he never got confused about this. But unfortunately this morning, if we're kind of being honest with ourselves, oftentimes that's not the case for us. Because for us, oftentimes, success challenges and confuses the best of us. It challenges and confuses the best of us. It takes just a little bit of success, and all of a sudden we're telling ourselves, I can do it. I got this, right? I got this covered. I can be in control again. Just a little bit of success, and next thing we know, we're placing ourselves back in charge. We're back to trusting ourselves first, no matter what it might be. No matter what it might be, we begin to drift back into this me box. No matter what it is, maybe it's success in a talent or ability that we have, right? We think to ourselves, I got this, I'm good at this, and it goes back in here. Or maybe it's academically, right? We got straight A's, whatever it might be, right? All of a sudden, God, I got this, I'm good. Maybe it's success when it comes to our careers, right? I got that promotion I've been waiting for, right? I'm good. Maybe it's financially, right? Financially, or with our possessions, right? We tend to drift back towards putting things in this box. Or maybe it's our families, our marriage, right? Our parenting, right? We get overconfident before we know it. Things are back over here. No matter what it might be, we find ourselves trusting ourselves again, instead of trusting God fully. See, David the king, he understood this. Even though he experienced it, even though he was guilty of some of this, he understood it and he recognized it and was quick to recover when he began to move in that direction. Unique thing about David, and we see this early on in David's life, when David was a 15-year-old shepherd boy, and the army of Israel is being challenged by the giant Philistine. Remember how the nation of Israel and King Saul responded in verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed. They were terrified. The army of Israel, including King Saul, they were terrified of this giant, this man, and what he was going to do. But then David arrives on the scene. This teenage boy, coming to deliver a care package to his brothers who were fighting in the army. And when David arrives, he hears Goliath. He hears this taunting, right? He hears these insults being hurled at the nation of Israel. And he thinks to himself, and we see a glimpse of David's character, his understanding of God's design for the nation of Israel. When he hears it, he's not afraid, like everyone else. Instead, David is offended. He's offended by the words of the giant. In fact, in verse 26, we find out what David says after hearing these words from Goliath. It says, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" See, David was seeing this through a different lens. He was seeing this from a different perspective than everyone else was. See, David, all the army of Israel saw was this giant who had killed who knows how many men just like them. And so they were afraid, right? For them, it was this hopeless military endeavor. But for David, it was so much more. See, he saw this giant. He saw Goliath. He saw the Philistines as threatening the work that God was wanting to do through the nation of Israel. He saw it differently. And he didn't fear. Well, eventually word would get back to King Saul that someone was actually considering fighting Goliath. Who was crazy enough to do that? There was someone brave enough to respond to the challenge, even though it very likely would end in their death. So Saul, he calls David into his tent and he checks him out. And the first thing he sees is this young little teenage boy, scrawny little boy. And he thinks to himself, this is no soldier. This is no warrior. This is no champion. And he tries to dismiss David. He tells him to go away, right? You can't handle this guy. But David insists. He explains how, as a shepherd, I've killed both lions and bears in defense of my flock. In fact, in verse 36, this is what David says. He says, your servant, speaking to Saul, has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. See, we see here this perspective, right? David, he's not confused like the others are. He sees this situation differently, and it gives him extraordinary clarity in life. He knew that Goliath was not simply defying the army of Israel. He was, in fact, defying God himself. And David, he lived, he operated, we see it all throughout his life. He operated with this belief, let's put it on the screen, that the man or woman whose hope is in the Lord need not fear. The man or woman whose hope is in the Lord need not fear, even when there is something giant to be afraid of. Well, as you know, David, he would later become king. And one of the amazing things about Scripture, and Pastor Levi alluded to it, is that not only do we have an account of David's life, we also have some of his writings. See, David wrote many of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. And in these poems and songs that David wrote, he shares with us some of his innermost thoughts, his innermost feelings, his innermost emotions. And in Psalm 25, verse 1, he says these words, "In you, Lord my God, I put my trust." Where did David put his trust? Was it in his talent? Was it in his abilities? Was it in his knowledge? Was it in his power or his influence? Was it in his riches, his successes? None of those things. He put his trust in God. See, this is the perspective that God wanted the entire nation of Israel to have. This perspective of trusting God first. But instead, they went with a king of their own. But David understood this perspective that God wanted the people to have. And it's through David that we discover the perspective that your Heavenly Father wants you and me to have as well. It's in these words. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. And so there's no reason to fear, no reason to worry, no reason to wonder if you'll ever have enough, no reason to wonder if things are going to work out. Because in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. Well, back to the battlefield this morning. Again, the 15-year-old shepherd boy, David, calm, cool, and collected well beyond his years. Armed with the proper perspective of his role in God's plan, he makes his way down to the valley of Elah to face the giant. So imagine the scene if you can. Goliath, 9.5 feet tall, all this armor, this arms and spears and all of it. Goliath and the Philistines, they see this small boy approaching. I mean, honestly, They had to be laughing in David's face. They had to be after seeing him. And imagine being on the other side, being part of the army of Israel. Who did the king send? Not even a soldier, right? The shepherd boy, sent to fight the giant with the fate of the nation on the line, with the fate of their lives on the line. The boy is going to fight the giant. And as David makes his way down to approach and fight Goliath, here's what he says to the giant, verse 45. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And you know what happens next. David kills Goliath. And in that moment, he instantly becomes the most popular man in all of Israel, because David did something that even the king would not do, because David had a perspective that the king did not have, that the army did not have. And as a result of that perspective, David placed his hope not in the king, not in the army, not in himself. He placed his hope in the Lord. And because his hope was in the Lord, he was able to see clearly, act confidently, and walk humbly. See clearly, act confidently, and walk humbly. Now, I think this morning there's probably, each and every one of us probably can think of someone we know in our lives that has placed all of themselves, every area of their life, completely in the Lord. They've placed fully their hope in the Lord. Everything is in their God box, right? I think we all can think of someone like that. These are people, these are individuals that share that perspective that David had. And they recognize they simply cannot control all the outcomes in life. As much as they might try, they simply cannot. Because there's simply too many variables that are outside of their control. These are men and women and students that walk humbly with God. They wake up every day understanding we can't control all these outcomes. So instead of striving, instead of trying to control them all, instead of trying to manipulate everything to work out for their good and their way, instead of striving in all these ways, instead of trying to put everything back in their me box, instead, what do? They place the weight of their entire lives, all they are, all they have, into the only one that holds the whole world and all of its variables, all of its outcomes in the palm of his hand. And just like David, every day they declare, in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. In fact, can we say that together this morning? Whether you're here in person, online, say that out loud together. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. So imagine you're on your way to work, and you're thinking about, there's some exciting things going to happen today, right? Some good things, or maybe some things that you're kind of nervous about. Will you pray? In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. Imagine you're waking up in the morning, and whatever it is you're worried about or concerned about, whatever it might be, before you even get out of bed, will you say, in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. Maybe it's that time when you're the most popular person in the room, right? When your success is obvious. Your success is evident. Everyone's giving you those attaboys, heaping praise upon you for whatever it might be. Will you remind yourself, in you, Lord my God, I put my trust. Or maybe you're facing a giant of your own. And it feels like everything is stacked up against you. It feels like the giant is about to bring you down. Will you whisper those words to yourself? In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. Will you put everything in your God box? Will you trust God with everything, all of what you are and all of what you have? In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. You see, defeating the giants in your life doesn't begin with the right armor, doesn't begin with the right weapons. It begins with the right perspective, just like David had, to place fully the weight of his life in God's hands. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust.
Well, I hope that was a helpful and a meaningful message for you today. And if you would like to speak with anyone about the message or about anything going on in your life, we would love to connect with you. And there are many ways that you can do that. To connect with us, you can send us a message through our website, OntarioFirst.org. We'd also love to have you like us on Facebook or send us a message through Facebook Messenger. And you can also follow us on Instagram at Ontario Nazarene. We'd also like to invite you today to subscribe to this channel by hitting the big red subscribe button. And then click on the bell next to it so that you'll get notified whenever we upload a new video. And as always, we are right here every Sunday morning for worship service at 9:30 and 11 o'clock a.m., both in person and online. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope you've enjoyed your time with us. And we do hope to see you again real soon.